Oh no, Tim, it's the Joker.
Right, Paul. I'd better change to Batman.
No, I want to be Batman.
Oh, all right. Holy Kid Brothers. To the Bat Polls. Welcome to the Bat Polls, rejected by ABC execs as a nutty idea.
And then we dismantled the Bat Polls cave
This is
before we had a chance to move.
This is Tim in Tokyo with my brother Paul in Hanover, New Hampshire.
Howdy, everybody.
Our opening theme this time was a heavy metal version by Marin Drake, uploaded to YouTube June 14th, 2017 as a tribute to Adam West, who had died 5 days earlier. And we've had some metal versions before, but yeah, this was a pretty good one.
Yeah, it was. It sounded not just metal, but kind of Metallica-like, and then there was some squealing Eddie Van Halen stuff going on. I liked the vibe of the whole thing. It was shot pretty well, and even though not all of the fretboard work is synced with what's actually happening on the soundtrack, it's faked pretty well most of the time.
Yeah. This time we're going to talk about the genesis of Batman 66, the process of developing the idea and getting the decision to go ahead with it. You know, what happened before the casting started. And so this is kind of the direction we went in, as we mentioned last time, looking at the February 1994 issue of Cinefantastique magazine, which was a double issue on film versions of Batman. Not only 66, but also the Michael Keaton Batman films and the animated series. No 40s serials.
Right. And at this stage, they're still announcing that Michael Keaton and Tim Burton are on board for Batman 3, as they're calling it in the magazine. So that wasn't quite right. But, I have to insert this reference. But, the title of this magazine is the same as, it reminds me of a favorite song from the first Franz Ferdinand record. Ich heiße Cinefantastisch, ich heiße Cinefantastisch, ich heiße Cinefantastisch.
Hadn't even thought about that, but yeah, it's been a while since I listened to it. By the way, in case you'd like to hear us talk about the 40s serials, look up episodes 53 and 71, way back in 2017.
Yes, and and be sure you have a very large glass of water with you, because you won't be able to get up for a while. Take plenty of bathroom breaks when you can.
Well, it's better than watching the serials, maybe.
Could be. It doesn't take quite as long as watching the serials.
Yeah, an endless stream of the same car going over a cliff.
Yes, an endless stream of the same theme music, which was never all that great to begin with, but it is kind of strange that it doesn't appear in this issue, but perhaps they had, thrashed that horse long before. I just don't know.
Yeah, perhaps.
Not a long-time reader at all of Cinefantastique. I called it Cinefantastique. Now I'm stuck. I'm stuck in the quasi-German pronunciation.
So most of the bylines in this magazine are Bob Garcia, and the remaining ones are Joe Desris. And of course, many years later, they became authors of Batman, A Celebration of the Classic TV Series, a.k.a. the Bat Coffee Table book. And this magazine is kind of a proto-Bat Coffee Table book. You can find some of the same quotes in both of them. I did find that there are some differences, though. Maybe by the time they did the book, they had done further research and found out some things they didn't know in 93, 94.
Yeah, and there are what seems like some glaring errors. Like on page 37 of the magazine, this is not an article we'll be talking about today, but the This article is called Bat Music, and the subtitle is Nelson Riddle composed original scores for each of 120 episodes. No, he didn't.
No.
And in fact, it's just Garcia just mentions that when he wasn't able to write, to compose, he would bring in Billy May, here and there to do an episode. But Billy May's name is down as the composer for the incidental music for the entire third season.
Well, and it also calls him Billy Mays.
Oh, right. The brother of the famous baseball player.
Willie Mays and Billy Mays, sure. So I kind of wanted to throw in an idea that I had a while back to look at the cultural atmosphere in 65 as the idea was coming up to make the show. Mm-hmm. So I got a lot of this from popculturemadness.com. Some is from Wikipedia or other sources. Of course, the American and Soviet space programs were going on at the time. On March 1865, Alexei Leonov became the first person to walk in space. A big movie that year was The Sound of Music, making Julie Andrews probably the biggest star in the U.S. at the time, which was interesting because, now you probably already know this, she had been the lead on Broadway in My Fair Lady, but they didn't choose her for the film because she wasn't well known enough at the time.
Ah, right. So Audrey Hepburn wound up playing that part.
Right. And then in the 65 Oscars, Audrey was beaten by Julie for Mary Poppins.
Oops.
So take that, Audrey Hepburn.
Yeah. Yes, a serious faux pas on there. It's just a error of foresight on the studio's part.
Yeah, well, I mean, there are dozens of those kind of stories. Decca Records and the Beatles.
Oh, sure.
65 was the year of the most successful James Bond movie ever, Thunderball. Made over $141 million in 1965 money, which Pop Culture Madness says would be over $1 billion today.
And it spawned that amazing Tom Jones theme. What's new, Thunderball? Whoa, whoa, whoa.
Dr. Zhivago was also a big movie that year.
Oh, man. Yes, that was a big year. And it was a big year for Tim, because Tim happened to be born that year.
Yeah, the world was treated to my presence or something like that. On TV, the most popular show was, any guesses?
Oh, boy. The Beverly Hillbillies?
No.
Wow, I'm not sure why I'm having so much trouble with this one, but please tell all.
Not a sitcom.
Not a sitcom, okay. Mission Impossible, no.
One other hint?
Yes.
Western.
Oh, right, Bonanza.
Bonanza, right. It was most popular of both the 64-65 season and the 65-66 season.
Yes, of course. How could I have been so stupid?
In 65-66 season, Gomer Pyle was number 2.
Yes, it certainly was.
I knew that was coming.
Let's skip the bathroom humor for now.
The Lucy Show was number 3. Red Skelton was number 4.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Number 5 for the season was the Thursday episode of Batman. That's getting ahead of ourselves for this discussion.
Yes.
Also in 65, after 5 seasons on ABC, My Three Sons moved to CBS because ABC didn't want to pony up to shoot the show in color. It lasted 7 more seasons on CBS.
Yeah, more foresight issues on the parts of network and studio executives. Whoops.
The Beatles played the first single-band mega concert at Shea Stadium in 65. And they had 5 number 1 hits in the U.S. that year.
Okay.
I Feel Fine, 8 Days a Week, Ticket to Ride, Help, and Yesterday.
Okay.
So you can see what point of their career we're at here.
Yeah.
So the top song of the year was not by the Beatles. Any guesses?
Ooh. No, I'm not going to embarrass myself.
Okay. I Can't Get No Satisfaction.
Okay.
By the Rolling Stones. Other number one songs, Downtown by Petula Clark, My Girl by the Temptations, Help Me Rhonda by the Beach Boys, Mr. Tambourine Man by the Byrds, and Eve of Destruction by Barry McGuire, which surprised me a little bit that it was that early, because in my mind, not having been, I was around, but I wasn't aware of what was going on. In my mind, Eve of Destruction, I might have guessed to be a little later, like more into the hippie movement. That inspired me to look into the hippie movement in '65. And Wikipedia says that they were an established social group in the U.S. by '65. The Summer of Love is still 2 years away.
Right. And the hippie movement was much more, it began as much more of a fringe radical group in its way. Not radical in the sense of violence, but, it didn't get mainstreamed all that easily or quickly.
October 16th, 1965, in San Francisco, a hippie-adjacent group called the Family Dog, who were into psychedelic music and psychedelic drugs, hosted the event A Tribute to Dr. Strange, which was San Francisco's first psychedelic rock performance. It was also a costumed dance and light show. People were coming in dressed in all kinds of weird costumes and dancing to the music, which was really unusual at the time. Rather than just sitting and listening.
I see.
Held at the Longshoremen's Hall, which still exists, still standing, featuring Jefferson Airplane, and I guess Grace Slick was not a member yet.
Wow.
The Great Society.
This is before Surrealistic Pillow, then?
Yeah. Well, I didn't check what year that came out, but just maybe slightly before. The Great Society and the Marbles. I don't know those bands, but... Also in '65, after being rejected by 20 publishers, Frank Herbert's Dune was finally picked up by Chilton Books, a publisher previously known only for those big car repair manuals sold in auto parts stores.
Awesome. I love that juxtaposition. That's great.
Herbert left no stone unturned, I guess, in looking for a publisher.
Yes, he even went to Hallmark and had them, begged them to publish the book 2 pages at a time, or maybe 4. But that would have, been, the equivalent of maybe 600 greeting cards. Oh, Surrealistic Pillow was released in February of '67.
Okay. Games that were released in '65 that we were still seeing advertised on Saturday mornings in the '70s. Rock'em Sock'em Robots had launched the year before and was super popular in '65. Trouble and Operation launched in '65. Also a game aimed at girls called Mystery Date, which doesn't sound familiar to me at all.
Oh, I remember a stand-up comedian riffing on that game back in the 80s, I think. Apparently there was a theme song that went with it. Mystery Date, will he be a dream or a dud? So yes, it was all about making yourself very pretty and hoping that you'll end up with the cute guy in the game, which I guess was represented on a card or something.
Okay. I read a little bit about pop art too, because of course that was going quite strongly at the time. Yeah. And Wikipedia mentioned, and I don't remember if this came up before in our other pop art discussions, but product labeling and logos were a big part of the movement. And it made me think, now, is that where the idea to label everything on Batman came from?
That's interesting. I suppose labeling is a little different from logos, like the Brillo and Campbell Soup logos that Andy Warhol lifted for his paintings.
Yeah, I'm not sure if they're talking about the same kind of labeling, but I don't know if they had picture posted on a picture in the art gallery.
That would be funny.
Art gallery.
Well, certainly signage shows up in some, more representational type pop art. But, I always thought that the labels on everything in Batman 66 probably derived from the labels on everything done, non-diegetically, as it were, in Dick Tracy. The arrows pointing to things like the two-way wrist TV. Something that was infinitely parodyable by you when you produced your Sick Tracy comic back in the 80s.
Artland.com mentions English pop artist Richard Hamilton in 1957 listed the characteristics of pop art. Pop art is popular, designed for a mass audience, transient, short-term solution, expendable, easily forgotten, low cost, mass-produced, young, aimed at youth, witty, sexy, gimmicky, glamorous, big business. Now, low cost doesn't describe the making of Batman, except maybe in season 3, but a lot of those other words do.
Yes, they do. And, not to lose the thread of campiness from this, but also performativity, kind of performing as pretending to be something that you're not, and until you become that thing that you're pretending to be. This was kind of the philosophy of Andy Warhol, was to, be an artist by being an artist rather than by painting necessarily. Although he certainly was an artist, and he was trained, and, he was trained as a graphic designer, and all of that, but just the notion of performing a role and making your paintings in a way, or your sculpture perform a role as well, like pretend to be art even though you're a soup can or a giant pile of meticulously painted Brillo pad boxes, painted on wood. Those were there was something about the monumentality of them that made them unavoidable, at least to consider as related in some way to art, even if it was a parody of art. But there's that, notion of kind of, playing a role on purpose and for the sake of constructing yourself according to that role, rather than just taking the role on and then throwing it away when you're, finished doing your stage thing or whatever. All the world was a stage for Andy Warhol, certainly.
Hey, Bat fans. You've heard the name Dan E. Cool on this show more than once as a contributor to the Bat Inbox. He's also a contributor to our Patreon, and he asked us to share a promo for a project he's currently fundraising for on Kickstarter. It's called Visonic Dome, and it's a hands-free way to clean your contact lenses with the push of one button. Visonic Dome promises cleaner, more comfortable contact lenses at a low cost and with little effort, and eliminates rubbing and irritation. The Visonic Dome Kickstarter has already funded, and there are just 2 weeks left for you to get on board. So follow the link in the show notes to support Visonic Dome. And we thank Dan for supporting our Patreon page at patreon.com/deconcomics. Now back to the show. Okay, so on to Batman itself, and in Cinefantastique, so I was focusing on 3 things for this episode. The main article that kind of snakes through the whole multiple dozens of page feature, I call it the snaky article.
Yes, Tim and I have nicknamed it Snaky in our communications about this.
On many of the spreads, it's just one column out of the whole spread, and so you're going past all these other articles, and then there's also an episode guide snaking through as well. So reading that, up to the point where it starts talking about casting, then there's an article on Dozier on pages 12 and 13, and on Semple on pages 44 and 45.
Right.
And in the snaky article, let's just call it that, it's the easiest thing to call it, Bob Garcia starts out talking about, as we are, about sort of the environment of 65. And he mentions television was doing a balancing act between ripping off the movies, parodying the movies, and trying to figure out just what it could do differently than the movies. So I thought that was interesting. And maybe he's saying that was maybe what somebody decided to try with putting Batman on TV. I don't know.
Right. Yeah, you hear a great deal in film studies academia about the ways in which film tried to distinguish itself from television during those first couple of decades of TV by using widescreen and 3D and making more films in color in the 50s and 60s than had been considered practicable earlier. But seeing a reference to the way that television tried to distinguish itself from film, that interests me. I hadn't really thought of Batman in those terms before. So I wonder what that means exactly.
What can television do that film can't?
Well, certainly the kind of the much more kind of rigorous structure of seriality on television is something you can play around with, and Batman certainly did. By the 1960s, movie serials would have been a terrible idea to have, because not enough people were going to films, and certainly children were not going to films nearly as much as they had in the 30s and 40s when in the heyday of the Republic and Columbia action serials. But television could do it better anyway because it was scheduled very specifically for a certain time and a certain in certain days in a way that it was regulatable and regularized for the audience.
Yeah. He also mentions or points to a quote from Charles Fitzsimons, the assistant producer at Greenway, saying Batman turned the conventional wisdom on its head, quoting, "The villains were entertaining and colorful, and Batman was a bore." The hero wasn't the really cool guy. It was the bad guys who were cool.
Right. Was it in the... I shouldn't be asking this. I should just be telling you and the listeners this. But was it in the Lorenzo Semple article, which discusses the Bible for the show that Semple apparently put together, but that has never been located? We don't have any idea of its where it would be found if it still exists. But was it there that it was mentioned that trying to make Batman more heroic or more likable was a terrible idea? I mean, he is heroic, but I think making him more likable and relatable was what Semple was against.
I think what you're talking about is a bit that's in the Snakey article. Let's see, talking about Bruce specifically, making Bruce more normal. On pages 17 and 18. And this is in the back coffee table book, too. Addressing Dozier's comment about Bruce Wayne not seeming normal enough for the audience, quote, "I quite understand what you mean by, quote, normalizing, unquote, Bruce, but I'm not worried about it," wrote Semple. "The way I see him, he is so ineffably square that he has a sort of sui generis normality."
Sui generis, like, coming from within, like he's a monad, he's, just himself.
Okay, thanks. I knew I was mispronouncing that. Normality, strictly his own. So, and that was an interesting idea to me because I'd never thought of whether anybody identified with Bruce as, if he seemed abnormal or not. I mean, for kids, I don't know, we don't care because he's Batman. So...
Right.
Maybe adults watching in the 60s would have thought he seemed like a kind of an odd guy, especially if they, were not into superheroes, if they had never been into superheroes.
Right, but you've hit the nail on the head, Tim. That is, as kids, who cares? We're just waiting desperately for him to get into his cowl.
We never liked Shakespeare so much as when his head was popped open and the bat-pull button was...
Yeah, seriously. Oh, thank God for William Shakespeare. Not for him, there wouldn't be a trigger in his neck or something. Anyway.
And it mentions Peyton Place had also been on twice a week. I think we might have talked about this before. And at one point, it was on 3 times a week.
Yeah, and that was ABC 2.
Yeah.
So ABC had already experimented with that programming structure.
And skipping ahead past our kind of target part of the Snakey article, on page 41, and we kind of came close to talking about this last time in the Mr. Zero episode, but it was, in fact, ABC's idea to make the show 2 half hours, not Semple's or Dozier's. But that idea didn't come down until November 65. That surprised me that it was so late.
Yeah, that's crazy.
I mean, they'd shot the pilot by that time.
Right. So apparently the cliffhanger was simply a commercial break in its earliest incarnation.
I guess so. Now, I had to kind of laugh. On page 14, 20th Century Fox was chosen because they were big enough to handle the costs, and they certainly ran up the costs.
Yes, they certainly did.
And I guess Greenway was located on the 20th lot.
Yeah, that's not too unusual for independent producers to have offices right there on whatever lot they work the most closely with.
And Dozier was a big enough name because he had been an exec at CBS and elsewhere. That brought the project some prestige. Now, I was struck by how many people in the early development had serious doubts about the whole idea. I mean, if we look at the magazine here, everyone's first reaction is, "That's crazy. What are you talking about?" No way, including Dozier, of course, but not just him, ABC execs and everybody.
Right, and when the audience tests were done, what was it? ASI was the name of the company, or ADI? Audience, zipping through the pages
that's
here.
later also.
Oh, okay.
Because
but when the polling was done of audiences, the score was so low that ABC was saying, pull the plug. Well, at least according to reports.
Yeah, well, what I saw was that by that time it was too late because they'd already contracted for the episodes. So they just had to kind of, take a leap of faith, hold their noses and jump and hope that people watched the darn thing.
Right. Audience Surveys Incorporated was the name of the company that tested the pilot.
ASI, okay.
Right. To my knowledge, this is Harv Bennett, who went on to produce Star Trek movies in the 80s. To my knowledge, it was the lowest ASI ever recorded. Batman scored a 49. And the average pilot would have scored 68. So the silence was continuous for 5 minutes, and then they even, dubbed in Dozier saying, "What you're about to see is a comedy. Be prepared to hiss the villains and cheer the heroes." And that didn't do any good for the next test. It didn't, it didn't move the needle a millimeter in any direction.
Yeah, and I thought that was interesting because that's similar to what he says at the beginning of High Diddle Riddle.
That's right.
The thing that was cut out for syndication.
You think Gotham City is a peaceful city? Ho, ho, ho! Put your gum under your seats, hold your breath, and get ready to cheer Batman and hiss his diabolical enemies. Hissable enemy number 1 is now about to strike.
I was interested, too, so in the Bat Coffee Table book, and to some extent in the Bat book also, I looked at Joel Eisner's Bat book for this episode, they both mention the meeting of Semple and Dozier in Madrid in May of 65, but the magazine doesn't. It makes me think that Garcia and Desris had not gotten to that point in their research yet or something, that they didn't seem to know about the meeting. Because according to the magazine, after Dozier went to New York and had a meeting there, it seems like he just went back to Hollywood. Where, in Bat Coffee Table book, he then so he's on vacation. He's having a lot of meetings during his vacation. He's with his wife. And the New York trip is part of his vacation, and then they go on to Spain. And while just conveniently, he has work to do there too.
Yes.
Meeting with Semple. And by the way, after our Mr. Zero episode came out, we got a message from Mr. Glee of the all-seeing, all-knowing 66 Batman message board. And he sent us a Dozier memo that contradicts the Bat Coffee Table book regarding what was the intended subject of that meeting. Because the Coffee Table book says it was Mr. Zero, but according to this memo, it was Number One Son.
Okay, the Bruce Lee vehicle.
Yeah. And I was a little surprised to see it was still being discussed at that stage 3 months after Bruce Lee's screen test, because I thought ABC just said no. I'll put that memo in the show notes, but then actually it occurred to me to glance at a few of the many, many scans that we've been sent by listeners, and I was looking in the trove that Ben Bentley sent quite a while back, and there are a bunch of letters there from Bruce Lee to Dozier. And there's one from August 65. August, so 3 more months after the Semple-Dozier meeting, where Bruce is asking Dozier for updates on the progress of Number One Son.
Interesting.
So that's a whole 6 months after the screen test.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering now about that story that they... Why would they drag it out for 6 months and then say, oh, we don't want an ethnic hero? That doesn't really make sense to me.
Right.
But then, in another letter from February 66, by that time he's mentioning he has ideas for Green Hornet. So the breakdown of Number One Son and the starting of Green Hornet happened somewhere between August 65 and February 66.
That's good intel, Tim. That's interesting.
Yeah, I wish we could get it narrowed down more than a 6 month range, but but it's somewhat useful to know that.
It is.
Now, the magazine mentions that where it skips over anything about going to Spain, it mentions Dozier's first idea for the writer of the pilot was Eric Ambler, who was a mystery novelist, a British mystery novelist who I'd never heard of, but I read up on him a little bit. But I don't know, reading about like what kind of work he did, it kind of made me wonder, why would you choose him to write Batman that's supposed to be a comedy? It didn't seem like he was really a comedy writer.
Yeah, I'm not really sure about that either. I mean, there are some films like Journey into Fear, which was ghost directed by Orson Welles, that are based on his work, that are quirky. They're kind of like stories about normal people who wind up in completely absurd, surreal, like espionage situations.
Yeah, that's what Wikipedia said too.
Yeah, so that makes sense in a way, but I think probably the prestige attached to his name as a well published and best selling novelist probably was meant to attract networks more than necessarily exactly what he would do with the material.
Yeah. I misspoke. It was spy novels, not mystery novels.
Right.
But, yeah, the magazine says that Ambler was amused but declined.
Yes, I mean, he would have been in his 60s by then, early 60s at least.
But, yeah, I'm not sure where that fits into the story of going to Spain and meeting with Semple. I can't quite make it fit, because it seems like in New York was when he kind of was convinced to do it. But then if he was going to meet Semple, when would he have contacted Ambler?
Right.
And, of course, famously, as he's flying from California to New York, an ad exec that he knows sees him on the plane reading Batman comics, and he can't explain because it's still top secret, what they're doing. So he says, yes. I felt like an idiot.
Yes, that's a great little story.
Yeah, what the guy says, I guess those scripts do get kind of dull.
Yes. So he's switching over to a comic book. Imagine Dozier with a comic book hiding in a script for a pilot or something that he's watching, as though he were, just pretending so he could get away with reading the comic. But, since he'd never read comics as a kid, and Dozier claims his parents didn't allow him to read comics, and he got a real distaste for them at that time, it must have been especially embarrassing for him
right.
to be, caught by people he knew on the plane reading a funny book.
Well, and even before Dozier was involved, so this is a quote from this guy Udoff. What was his Yale? Udoff. I'm not sure how to pronounce it. Udoff.
Yeah, and the article mentions he went on to write the screenplay for Eve of Destruction in the 80s, and had done some other, kind of genre work too.
But he's quoted as saying, "Between Sherrick and me was the director of development, Doug Kramer, who had a large art collection and was very interested in pop art. He got behind it. Then Sherrick thought it would work. Sherrick in turn sold it to the head of the network, Thomas More. All these executives were flying back to New York from L.A., reading Batman comics hidden in their Fortune magazines, and I got not even a $5 raise out of it."
It was my idea, all mine. Yes, that's kind of a sad story.
Well, I would have liked to have seen them with Batman comics in their Fortune magazines. That would have been
that part of the story would have been fun to try to reproduce. Too bad it didn't show up in Back to the Batcave as a staged scene.
Yeah, well, I think Back to the Batcave was more concerned with casting onwards and not
before casting. Not with development. Mm-hmm.
So Semple says he immediately thought of it as a comedy. Now, there's a disagreement about whose idea it was to play it on two levels, serious for kids and funny for adults.
Right.
Both Semple and Dozier said it was their own idea.
Right, but there's a quote here from, was it Fitzsimons, who says that Dozier was such a creative guy that he would not, and such a mensch that he would not have taken credit for something that just wasn't in his nature.
Yeah.
So my sense is probably that they came up that. My guess here is that Semple and Dozier came up with that notion independently of each other.
Yeah.
And, no matter who mentioned it to whom first, they both thought they had the idea first.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Semple says on page 17, "Now Bill says he took the idea to ABC to sell it. That he took a full script and not the idea is the small thing he fails to mention."
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, Semple had written the 60-page pilot script, and that was what Dozier took to the network.
Right. Oh, it was Harv Bennett who said that Dozier wouldn't have given Semple the credit if Semple came up with the idea and not Dozier. Okay. Bill was too creative a man to steal or not give credit, said Bennett. That's page 17 as well.
Okay. I would have liked to have been a fly on the wall, well, really for all of this, but in particular for the meeting between Semple and Robert Butler.
Mm-hmm.
Because, they talked a lot about how it should be directed. And, Butler came up with things like, tilting the camera for the bad guy's hideout. And
mm-hmm. Yes, and it's interesting to see that Semple was thinking about things like Dutch angles and other ways of, shooting the show in a kind of cartoony looking or comic booky looking way. Robert Butler, I didn't know anything about him before reading this article, but it turns out he was a fairly young man. He was in his late 20s and was a veteran of Hogan's Heroes by this point. He had directed some episodes of that show.
Well, I found that the magazine on page 35 says that he was 29, but according to Wikipedia, he would have been 38 at the time. Because he was born in 1927.
I see. Okay.
So that's an error in the magazine, apparently.
Mm-hmm. Well, there are other errors, too, like the one I mentioned to you that comes from outside the purview of our discussion here. And that's that...
Ross.
Stanley Ralph Ross somehow And this is quoted, pretty much verbatim and written up as if it were true. Ross tells the story of having written a Batman Catwoman wedding episode that ended up starring Eartha Kitt, and there was no complaint, even though it was shot as scripted and then it was aired, and there were no complaints anywhere about the interracial marriage that was implied, at least, by that possibility that the wedding brought up. But of course, in the same issue, there's an episode guide that makes, for all 3 seasons, that makes no mention of any wedding episode with Catwoman or anybody else. I mean, besides the women whom Batman nearly married.
Well, Marcia.
Like Marcia. Right, exactly. That just completely, my jaw dropped open. It's like, how can you publish this as fact when the same issue over which you apparently had some control, since most of this material is yours, Mr. Garcia, how could you not have known that this was, was he being so respectful of Stanley Ralph Ross that he refused to even present him with the truth?
Yeah, I would really like to know where that story came from. Of course, we heard it in the TV Academy interview with Ross.
That's right.
But yeah, it seems like everybody has their repeated stories that are provably untrue.
Yeah, and that story makes Stanley Ralph Ross look really good, really progressive, and, it was no big deal to have interracial, romance or interracial marriage presented on TV in the 60s, which is all, total BS. The interracial kiss between Spock and Kirk and Uhura in Star Trek, it got clipped out of many prints of that show in the South in particular.
Mm-hmm. Also on page 18, there's some discussion of the character of Robin from a letter written by Semple.
Yes, that's good stuff.
I think it's important to think of him, Robin, as essentially 15 plus rather than 16 plus, if you see what I mean. He's a very big boy rather than a very young adult. Teenage girls swoon at him, all right, but his mental processes, if any, are boyish, not mannish. I see him as Jack Armstrong, not that odious parking lot attendant in the old 77 Sunset Strip.
I'd love to know what he's talking about.
I don't know who Jack Armstrong.
No, I don't either.
Again, and I think you agree, I conceive this whole thing being so gorgeously square that it's hip, so far out, capital O, that it's in, capital I. No necessity to make it modern by using teenage slang and whatnot. Indeed, on the contrary.
Right, when the only times that Robin uses teenage slang is either when he's been gassed by Catwoman, or is pretending to be a bad guy to infiltrate Joker's little high school gang.
Sue, baby.
Yeah, exactly. So I found on Wikipedia, Jack Armstrong, the All-American Boy, was a radio adventure series which maintained its popularity from 1933 to 1951. So this is a character who was supposed to be the milk-drinking, patriotic type. Not that Robin isn't the milk-drinking type, at least. Certainly the patriotic one.
And then Fitzsimons talks about all the preparation, getting all the props and costumes together. And, yeah, he says, we knew exactly what we were doing. It was completely created before we even started to shoot a foot of film. Batman was one of the most rigorously planned things in television. It took me several months from the time Dozier sat down with me at lunch and said we were going to do it. From that time, I started research on the comic books to plan the tests. From designing costumes and batarangs and all of the kind of nonsense that was involved, to trying to find a certain kind of silk to make Batman's cloak, so that the hollows would be dark and the ridges would be highlights, and designing the mask he wore. There was an enormous amount of preparation involved. I thought that was particularly interesting about the cape. You have to think about how it's going to look on camera.
Yeah, for sure. Getting the highlights is pretty crucial because otherwise the cape could disappear into darker backgrounds. And it wouldn't look very dynamic the way that the cape always looks in superhero comics.
Yeah. And he also mentions that rather than having a phony body like the Keaton Batman, where the body is part of the costume, they went in the opposite direction in search of camp.
Yeah, so that Batman's gray T-shirt makes him look downright pudgy from certain angles.
Fitzsimons also says in the Dozier article on pages 12 and 13 that Dozier was unusually decisive for an executive. Mm-hmm. Executives are usually not decisive, he says, but Dozier would say, the statistics are you can only be right or wrong. If you give a decision, you're going to be right half the time.
Well, I'm not sure that's entirely true. Some people are better at reading the tea leaves than others.
Mm-hmm. And supposedly Dozier had a great sense of fun. And Fitz mentions that he had set up an elaborate racetrack for 6-inch model cars in his large playroom. And I wonder if that's the same set that we see at the end of season 2.
That's all I can think of.
Yeah.
That's not a space that we see normally on the show, but
right. It's part of the Green Hornet set.
yeah, but I didn't catch a reference to where the playroom is, according
just
to
somewhere in Wayne Manor.
Well, but it sounds like it was Dozier's playroom, like his someplace in his house, maybe.
Where he actually kept this racetrack.
Yeah, I'm not suggesting that scene from the end of season 2 was filmed in that space, but. Well. Anyway, I think that the vectors get a little mixed up in that part of the article.
Sounds to me like the Greenway office space was not big enough to accommodate that big racetrack.
Sure, yeah, I couldn't imagine that either.
And I guess Greenway didn't exist all that long. Basically, just like, what did they say, 60 or 61 until 68?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, something like that. And then it was the name of the company was changed slightly for producing the film, since I think they combined forces with another production company.
Right. What does it change to? Green something else.
Yeah, not Greenhouse, but something along those lines.
It was called Green Lawn Productions.
Well, let's see. Are there any other ways in which the 60s pop culture and, even the kind of political and historical landscape seems to have been a particularly, productive oven for baking the Batman show? A fortuitous oven, at least.
Well, I mean, clearly the pop art thing was on their minds. Mm-hmm. I don't think the hippie thing was. Because hippies were not their target audience at all.
No, certainly not. And
maybe some hippies got into it, but they weren't the target.
Right. No, I can understand hippies getting into it, perhaps not as hard as they fell for Doctor Strange.
Well, I mean, I can imagine hippies taking drugs and then watching it and seeing something that nobody else saw.
It's like, oh, wow, man, look at all the question marks. They're floating in front of my eyes, man. It's an existentialist reference, man. He can't decide on the nature of humanity, so he's covered with question marks.
I don't know. Well, did you have any thoughts about the cultural environment of 65 affecting the show?
Well, I'm not really exactly. I mean, we've certainly talked about all kinds of stuff regarding that question in the past, but looking at it specifically in terms of other shows that were on and, what Dozier was up to during that time in other parts of his producing career is all pretty interesting. I had another thought, though, about the, what TV can get away with or do that film can't. And I think what occurred to me, because I can barely remember it now, it was a whole 10 minutes ago that it came to mind.
We're old, folks.
Sorry, it's the end of the term, folks. I'm grading. I'm like, I know Tim has been doing a lot of grading lately as well, so it's amazing how that can kill your soul after a while, and I'm sure the students feel the same way. Writing papers for Professor Young kills my soul after a while. So I figure after I've graded my 60th paper of the term, it's a little bit like the students getting revenge on me at last. It's like, you made us write these papers? Well, you have to read them. Ha 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 ha. Anyway, no, they're good papers. Anyway, but it does get a little tiresome after a while just to, do one after the other. anyway, what occurred to me is that you can do a show like Batman on television, perhaps more, and get away with more. You can get away with like cheaper sets than you could with a film during this time in Hollywood. Films were either like, total bottom of the barrel, low budget movies made by non-central studios, Poverty Row studios, like American International, the Roger Corman, studio, where they were, making films for, roughly an eighth to a tenth of what most mid-level film budgets cost. But, you could get away with a fair amount with, very little money without alienating the audience and making them feel like they're not getting their, ticket money's worth because they're not paying anything, except for the television itself, and their time when it comes to watching the ads in order to see this. And they could also, play around with and experiment with the kind of day-glow aesthetic and the camp in a way that I don't think a movie could have gotten away with, because it's hard to sustain that level of campiness for a couple of hours unless you're really, really tightly scripting it, and your performers are all really into it, or you're just making a terrible movie and everybody is campy by accident.
It'd be easy to overdose on it then in a
exactly
film.
Yeah,
the audience would get tired of it.
Yeah, so once again, the serial format is one of the aspects of the Batman formula that makes it work, that simply wouldn't, it wouldn't function properly in a 2-hour film scenario, especially during this moment where it was basically for Hollywood studios all or nothing. You either make, a B- movie, from a minor studio, or you put all your chips on The Sound of Music and just cross your fingers that this huge budget movie will actually make something back for you.
Do like a Cecil B. DeMille.
Yeah,
with
exactly.
A cast of thousands.
Studios used to make like, a couple of hundred movies a year per studio, in fact, in the pre-war era. And by this time, they're making like, well, let's just say a very small percentage of that number, somewhere between 30 and 50, if even that. And most of them were independently produced, and the studios would just package them and distribute them and do the marketing.
So this is kind of off topic, but you're talking about the film industry at the time makes me wonder. So, I mean, logically, in the 60s, movie audiences were smaller than like in the 40s or the 30s.
Oh, absolutely.
Did cinema then kind of rebound? Like, was the 60s a low point compared to the 70s or 80s?
Oh, yeah, I would say so. I mean, 1947 was the worst year, I think. Was it? Well, it goes either this way. 46 was the best year in Hollywood's ticket sales history, and 47 was the worst year in Hollywood ticket sales history, box office history, or it was 47 and 48. I think it was 46 and 47. Because of the GI Bill and families moving to the suburbs, on the GI Bill, and getting inexpensive quality housing outside of city centers where all the movie theaters were. After the war, people migrated basically away from inner cities where the movie theaters were, and so driving into town to
no suburban malls with multiplexes in them.
That's right. So, before too long, that situation gave birth to the drive-in, but the studios that owned the best theater chains and were just being divested of those chains by by an antitrust action on the part of the federal government in the 1940s. The studios didn't want anything to do with, cheapo drive-in theaters. They thought it would reduce the prestige of their products. Meanwhile, the drive-ins gave birth to tiny production companies that wound up, making some money and becoming successful by supplying these suburban drive-in theaters. And besides that, there was television. There was, community activities, picnics. Board games were becoming a huge, a huge sales coup for toy manufacturers. These were things that families were encouraged to do on the weekends and the evenings, rather than go to the movies. Drive all the way into town to go and dress up to go to a movie. So, the 60s were a pretty lousy time for the movies, except for these few blockbusters, and that's what Hollywood was doing. They were doing their best to, kind of sustain themselves with, really cheapo features that they bought outright or, distributed from small-time producers, or they would just go all out and make Cleopatra, in 63, and spend, millions and millions of dollars and actually break even on the movie, but lose a lot based on the fact that they marketed the movie so expensively that they ended up losing money in the process and didn't make any money off of Cleopatra for decades, as far as I know. This was, I think, a Fox fall down, I believe. So, yeah, the 60s were a pretty terrible time for movies, and that's one of the reasons why, directors like Francis Ford Coppola, who had worked for Roger Corman, Martin Scorsese, who had worked for Roger Corman, and other directors who saw themselves as potentially auteurs, that is, directors who could control every part of the movies they made. They were able to get that kind of control very much like their European heroes from the 50s and 60s, precisely because the studios were willing to gamble on smaller movies that were more like the kind of art house movies that had been, coming out of Europe in the post-war era. So, yes, certainly by the mid-70s, Jaws and then Close Encounters and Star Wars, 75 and 77, had convinced the studios that, there was a new way, to make a blockbuster, a special effects blockbuster that was not as expensive as having a gigantic star vehicle, like Cleopatra, for example. But yeah, the 60s were not a great time to be in the movie business. This is the moment also at which big companies like Kinney Sales, which was basically a parking lot management company, ended up buying a studio. I think they bought Warner Brothers, actually, from the Warner family, after, decades of it being owned by, someone whose last name was Warner. The same went for Transamerica buying, United Artists and Kerkorian buying MGM. These studios were suddenly part of multinational conglomerates of which movies was just one tiny part of their business. And, was part of a portfolio rather than, kind of a life's work. That was an investment, so very, very different situation, just economically as well as in terms of, the ways of producing art in Hollywood in the 1960s.
Okay, so do we have anything to say about the Semple article? It mentions, you mentioned the Bible, which was just some compiled letters that he had written about his concept of the show, which they affectionately referred to as bat poop.
Bat guano.
A lot of it seemed to have been his comments on the instant freeze script, and we went over one copy of that, but I don't remember seeing a lot of these comments.
I thought I remembered seeing most of them.
Oh yeah? Okay.
Yeah. What pages is the Semple article on again?
44 and 45.
Right, okay. Yeah, there are no surviving copies of the Bible, but Semple's letters spell out his wisdom on bat riding, so what I wouldn't give to find that Bible, wherever it might be.
Oh, yeah.
But, reading this, I realize again, how much I would love to have met Lorenzo Semple. Mm-hmm. He must have been a really interesting character. I love how definitive he is in his claims about how Batman and Robin should be, and how protective he is of that vision. I think it's it really suggests someone who cared passionately about whatever he was working on at the time, even though he seems to have lost interest in Batman after that first season.
Mm-hmm. I was interested that Semple thought that they needed to do it cheaply. There was a need for budgeting restraint, which Garcia says was largely ignored by the producers, clearly, in the first two seasons anyway. 'Cause he thought that doing it kind of cheaply would add to the campiness.
Yeah, I think so. But, he also, and I just wanted to throw a shout out to High C for sending us these PDFs a million years ago. And I actually got my own copy of the magazine as well.
Which you found.
Which I found, yes. I'd hidden it from myself, not on purpose, but I kind of, allowed myself to indulge in a scavenger hunt the other day and actually came up with my copy. But something he says in 45 really caught my attention regarding the quote-unquote cheapness that he's calling for of the production. Semple sought to keep Batman heroic and ingenious. Quote, in principle, I really don't like an ending where salvation comes because Robin and cops have simply followed Batman. Dredge him from soup when the broth looks blackest, he wrote. This would only be acceptable if it resulted because Batman managed to broadcast some tricky clue to his whereabouts, which right under the villain's nose, which Robin would then interpret to cops. It was Semple who suggested the means to foil Mr. Freeze, which led to the show's penchant for far-out bat devices. Quote, there's another much simpler and more Batman-esque ending available, to wit, with his full knowledge of how Mr. Freeze works, isn't it certain that Batman would have equipped himself with some clever counter-gadget, super thermal underwear, a micro-miniature heating system built into his cape? Thus he would only be pretending to be frozen for whatever reason and would suddenly pounce for the climax. I mean, what's clever about that is that, it relies on a characterological principle. The Batman would always have some kind of gadget that would fix the issue, but it doesn't require any on-screen gadget production.
Yeah.
You're not going to show the audience the bat thermal underwear, and even if you did, you just buy some Hanes, some long undies, and slap them on Batman and call them bat thermal underwear.
Put a bat logo on it.
Yeah, exactly. Or the heater under his cape. Of course, they're not going to show that because it would look as though he had to have some kind of giant kerosene powered infrastructure under his cape. But it's kind of ingenious, right? That the ingenuity of Batman gets shown through basically a line of dialogue that proves that he had anticipated whatever problem he was going to run into, and it developed some gizmo that was going to save him from it. I think that's, it's really clever, and it's thinking like a kind of, hungry TV writer who needs to figure out ways to make sure that what's going to happen on the screen doesn't blow the budget and yet still seems sophisticated and internally unified, like it fits with the character's behavior and our understanding of who he is.
I was also interested in Semple's observation about the difference between their show and Batman comics. He says, I realize increasingly the gulf between comic book Batman stories and our own. We see Batman just sitting in front of his TV set moping around in this script. I realize this is very common pattern in original comic books. I submit that it's quite unacceptable for our tight-woven dramas. If a scene does not end with the words, let's go, then that must at least be implied. Indeed, were I producer Howie Horowitz, I would make a rubber stamp with that pithy and unbeatable phrase to stamp at end of scenes where it's lacking in drafts.
I love that.
And there certainly are a lot of scenes on Batman that end with "Let's go," or "We haven't a moment to lose," or some words to that effect.
Yeah, I just love the notion of a "let's go" stamp. How Horowitz can just slam it at the end of a scene. I'm reminded of the movie Top Secret, which is kind of an airplaned version of Dr. Zhivago meets Elvis Presley movie, where one of the Nazis, who's actually an East German military leader, says find him and kill him, and then stamps this report on the Val Kilmer character, and then there's a close up of what he stamped on it, and it says find him and kill him. Yes, that's his stamp. Howie Horowitz has the "Let's Go" stamp.
Okay, so yeah, there's some interesting stuff here. I need to read the Bat Coffee Table book again too, because I can't remember if I read some of the stuff already or not.
Well, that was 4 years ago, 3 years ago,
something like that. Yeah.
Our own podcast is lost in the mists of time. Tim was talking about a concept for a future episode of the podcast the other day, and I mentioned, yes, but that means we'd have to go back and watch the whole series again. And Tim said, well, we're going to have to do that anyway. if we ever do the favorite Bat Fights episode that some of our listeners are really interested in having us do. We're basically going to have to do the Holy Bat rewatch thing, I think. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but nevertheless.
Yeah, well, I mean, we could do that by seasons, but still.
Yes. Watching a whole season or the whole series for a single episode seems like a lot.
Favorite bat fight of January 1966. Favorite bat fight of February 1966.
I think you've got it. By gum, that's what we'll do. By Colonel Gum, that's what we'll do.
So we finally dug into this, and we'll have to come back to this more in the future for other topics.
Right, there are cool articles about costuming and makeup and set design and production design that are all worth looking into.
Mm-hmm.
Are you addicted to classic TV shows? Did you spend the 80s sitting in front of the boob tube? Then join us for TV Tangents, where we examine television of the 20th century with barely any contemporary context. Visit Shout Engine, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcasts, and look for TV Tangents.
Coming up, more from Adam and Burt on Batman the Movie, another Holy Deja Vu, and we read your mail in the Bat Inbox. Help support To the Bat Polls and all the Deconstructing Comics shows with a monthly donation to the Deconstructing Comics Patreon page at patreon.com/deconcomics. For just $2 a month, you get outtakes from every To the Bat Polls episode. Plus, Paul and I make bi-weekly videos for all patrons, usually featuring a TV trivia quiz. Our most recent video discussed the Mary Tyler Moore Show. Patrons can also vote in polls for which Bat topic you'd like us to cover next on this show. Further perks at higher support levels, including the right to have an ad for your own project on the show once a month, as Dan E. Cool did in this episode, and hours of podcasts on the early issues of The Amazing Spider-Man and on the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So go to patreon.com/deconcomics and select the level of your monthly donation. Thanks for listening, and thanks for your support.
Technologically, we had a tremendous crew, and everybody played their characters to the hilt. Everyone that on the crew loved doing the film. The actors and actresses, enjoyed it as well. And Adam and I had a great time. I mean, we were basically reprising what we were already doing on the series. I think what was interesting about making the movie Batman was that instead of it being the first thing that we did and then a television series coming afterwards, we already had a successful television series, and the movie was like the icing on the cake. We already had a following.
We did the movie the first summer hiatus after we started the series. Originally, they intended to do the movie first and use the movie, the theatrical release, to sell the series. But we got lucky in that the series was accepted and went on the air. We did, I think, 34 episodes and then did the movie. Why the movie? The movie was done to sell the series overseas. It was released overseas, and indeed it worked. And it kind of prepared the way for a series that nobody understood the mix. Nobody quite got it, what it was, for some time.
Thank you, monsieur. Thank you. If it hadn't been for you, right now I would be a dead man.
Yes, well, in that case, you wouldn't have been able to thank me.
Well, I would like to thank you properly. May I at least make a small bet for you? Say 5,000 francs? 5, please.
Well, thank you very much, but I rarely bet more than $1 or $2.
Numéro 2. Since you saved my life, I think we should meet. My name is Victor Royal.
Well, my name is, Wheel. Max Wheel.
Number 2 wins.
Have you been on the island long, Monsieur Wheel?
No, as a matter of fact, I just got here this morning.
Bets, please.
About 9.
Numéro 9. Number 9.
Holy Deja Vu. Once again, Maxwell Smart appears in the Holy Deja Vu segment. This time, he's distraught because 99 has left control. The Season 3 episode is called 99 Loses Control.
Holy Joy Division. She's lost control.
To marry her new boyfriend, a handsome, rich casino owner named Victor Royal. He speaks with a French accent. Hey, wait a minute. Is it Sacre Bleu? It is. It's Jacques Bergerac, better known to us Bat fans as Freddy the Feds.
Freddy the Fencer, yes.
The Patagonian cat's-eyed opus.
You said a triple soupçon.
Forget it.
Forget it.
Every gendarme in Gotham City is looking for these. It would be impossible for me to get rid of it.
Well, you got the best overseas contact.
It doesn't matter. There is a $3 million reward for these.
You won't touch him.
No. It's too hot. Besides, everyone knows that the Patagonian cat's-eyed opals are bad luck for anyone who steals them. Voilà.
I've also seen him on Dick Van Dyke Show, Season 2 episode, The Square Triangle.
Ah, absolutely.
Broadcast in February 1963.
By golly, I can't believe I didn't recognize him. I just watched that episode a couple of months ago.
He plays Jacques Savon, a singer who's guesting on The Alan Brady Show. Rob and Laura met him and his wife in France years ago when Savon wasn't famous yet. It turns out both Rob and Laura think they're responsible for the breakup of Savon's marriage.
Mm-hmm.
Robert Petrie?
Oh, hi, Jacques. He's not here.
But what is it with this man? I've tried to see him 4 times today.
Jacques, if you have a minute, we'd like to talk to you, please.
Yeah.
Sure. What is it?
Do you think it's fair to make Rob feel guilty after all these years? I mean, it wasn't his fault that Yvette had a roving eye.
Are you trying to say that Robert and Yvette...
Yeah, he told us all about it. And according to Laura, boy, you move pretty good yourself, Jake.
Jacques.
Jacques.
Yes. Now, wait a minute now. Now, you say that Robert thinks he came between Yvette and myself? And Laura...
Yeah, thinks she's the one responsible for your marriage collapsing.
It's ridiculous. They did not come between Yvette and myself.
Neither one of them?
Of course not. The thing that broke up my marriage with Yvette was a great and powerful mutual hatred for each other.
Yeah, I rewatched it this afternoon. It's a good episode.
Mm-hmm.
Bergerac's first IMDb credit is in the 1954 Ginger Rogers film Beautiful Stranger, also known as Twist of Fate. I couldn't get any info on why it has 2 titles.
Might be the British title as opposed to the American one.
Yeah, it was a British-American production, so
I bet that's right.
He got into that movie because he had met Ginger Rogers when she was vacationing in France, and they were married from 1953 to 1957. He played her love interest in the film as well. The film bombed, perhaps in part because Rogers, then 43, was cast as a 24-year-old. And suspension of disbelief only goes so far. Bergerac was 27 at the time. So Ginger Rogers was robbing the cradle there. He was married once more to Dorothy Malone from 1959 to 1964. They married in Hong Kong, where she was shooting her film The Last Voyage. Bergerac went on to do a number of American movies and TV shows, including 3 episodes of Alfred Hitchcock Presents, episodes of Perry Mason, Bob Hope Presents the Chrysler Theater, The Beverly Hillbillies, The Lucy Show, Daniel Boone, of all things, and, of course, 3 episodes of 77 Sunset Strip. But sadly, no Surfside 6.
Formidable.
On Batman, of course, he appeared in both Batman Displays His Knowledge with Catwoman and in the final episode, Minerva, Mayhem, and Millionaires, in 1968, the same year as his Get Smart appearance. His final film credit was on The Doris Day Show in 1969. After that, as I think we might have mentioned in a past episode, he quit show business and became the head of Revlon's Paris office and of the Parfums Balmain company. He died in 2014 in France, and as far as we can tell, he never in real life strained cooked spaghetti with a fencing mask.
Although it was an ingenious idea. Bat Inbox, response to our episode on Power Records Batman stories with guest J.B. Anderton. These are from the message board, including one from J.B. Anderton himself.
Yeah, and he says, "Thanks for having me on the show. Really enjoyed our conversation. Since our recording, I ordered the 66 Batcave playset from a third party within the U.S., as none of the Chicago area Target stores are stocking any of McFarlane Batman 66 merchandise. It should arrive as early as today. Fingers crossed. Update. It arrived the next day. Pick in the thread in the Bat merchandise section. I couldn't track it down. There are lots of pictures in the Bat merchandise section, though. And Danny Cool says, great episode. JB was the perfect guest to discuss this with. I'm sad to hear his own podcast is ending soon, though.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think podcasts are like anything else. They have their high points of highest interest, and for both the audience and the creators, and then then it's time to move on to something else, like Get Smart, for example, which may be where we wind up. Who knows? One from Batwinged Hornet. Power Records, where so many characters sounded like escapees from the Bowery Boys movies pretending to be superheroes. Yikes and then some. What's strange is that the late Peter Fernandez's voice leaned in that, hey, use punks want a sock in the mouth direction while he voiced Power Records characters, but years earlier his work on Speed Racer did not sound that way at all. I have vivid memories of Power Records, with my family getting a few. Strange thing is that initially we played them often, but the interest in Power Records dropped off a cliff only a few months after getting them. I've always believed this was due to being comic collectors who had the issues the Power Records were based on, the Marvel titles in any case. So aside from the novelty of hearing voices applied to superheroes, it was a one-shot adventure, one-time interest, while the real comic stories and characters moved forward. You guys had a side discussion about Batman big screen actors, and for me, the list of great Bat performances is a small one, as most never captured the kind of behavior one would think a Batman would have if he were a real person, or show how experienced he is by not coming off like a cosplayer prancing around at a comic convention, essentially balding comedic nerd Keaton, smirking Clooney, and stranger-than-fiction Kilmer. But his lips are beautiful, man. That's one of the reasons why he looks so much better than either Keaton or Clooney from the nose down, sticking out of his cowl. On that note, only Bale and Affleck almost perfectly delivered Batman in ways paralleling elements of his 70s to 90s character arc, with the bonus of Bale giving us a look at the character early in his career, while Affleck has a spot-on performance as the older, to-the-point, and jaded Batman, which is the way he's often written in Bat books of the past 30 years. Yeah, I've heard good things about Affleck's Batman from other friends as well. And I gotta say, I don't really see it, but I've only ever seen Batman vs. Superman, which is a movie that I disliked, vehemently for lots of other reasons. And I've never watched either the Joss Whedon Justice League or the Zack Snyder, final cut, the director's cut, the other director's cut of Justice League. But I think I could separate my sense of Affleck from my sense of those movies if I did sit down and watch them. It's interesting. I thought, the casting choice certainly was kind of inspired. And it was interesting that Affleck decided to take up the cowl. But we'll have to see how Robert Pattinson does as well. Maybe I'll watch the Affleck Batman before watching the Pattinson movie that's on its way out pretty soon.
So, yeah, feel free to write to us about anything. It doesn't have to be about a particular episode. If you have questions, and we did get some messages that I didn't really feel were good for the show, but asking us various questions. One writer was talking about trying to remember where there had been mention on our podcast of a scene where they were driving at night and there was a mirror, and it turned out it was in the Green Hornet.
Oh, okay.
It wasn't on Batman.
Got it.
Anyway, so you can write us at batpulls@deconstructingcomics.com or, of course, through the message board. So next time, finally, we're getting back to the topic of women on Batman, and we're going to look at the first half of Season 2, because it's just too huge to try to do in one episode. And Nancy Northcott will be joining us again, the romance novelist.
Excellent.
So, and we've already sort of divvied up the episodes here to watch and prepare. So we'll be back with that in 2 weeks here at the same Bat RSS feed. Check the show notes for the YouTube video of Marin Drake's heavy metal version of the theme, links to the memo on the intended focus of the Madrid meeting between Dozier and Semple, thank you Mr. Glee, and the Bruce Lee letters to Dozier, thank you Ben Bentley, the link to Dan E. Cool's Kickstarter project for Visonic Dome, and to the Bat message board thread about our Power Records episode. Batpulls at deconstructingcomics.com is the address to send us your Bat missives or any interesting Bat audio that we haven't used yet on the show. We're on Twitter at Decon Comics and on the Deconstructing Comics channel on YouTube. You can hear outtakes from this and every episode of To the Batpulls and vote for topics for future episodes by supporting us at patreon.com/deconcomics. You can also help us out by sending a one-time PayPal donation to Batpulls at deconstructingcomics.com, by shopping via deconstructingcomics.com/Amazon, by sharing our episodes on your social media, and by subscribing to the show on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. And spread the word. Let all your friends who are Batman 66 fans know about the show. What you're hearing now is Let's Go by the Cars, because that's what you have to say at the end of a scene of Batman. Next time, the women of the first half of Season 2. Holy Feminine Mystique. We'll see you in 2 weeks. To the Batpulls is a production of deconstructingcomics.com.